The story is told, though who can say if it be true, of a clan of medieval warriors awoken in modern-day Manhattan, of the animated series that told their story.
It is an age of darkness. Superstition and the sword rule. It is an age of fear. It is the age of gargoyles.
What could be strong enough to leave claw marks in solid stone? A good detective trusts no one.
That's one thing we have in common. Everything's going according to plan.
Then their descendants shall pay. I will have blood for blood.
Welcome to Voices from the Eyrie, a Gargoyles podcast.
Hello and welcome to Voices from the Eyrie, a Gargoyles podcast. I'm Zach Joyner, webmaster and executive producer of the Spidey Dude Radio Network. Thank you for listening to the show. This show is powered by Spidey-Dude.com. It's part of the general network that powers it. You can support this show if you like via patreon.com/SpideyDudeNetwork. You can also leave us a voicemail, 818-925-6631. We'll play that voicemail in a future episode. We also like to get emails every once in a while. Be sure to leave us an email if you like, gargoylesvoices@gmail.com. Follow us on social media. At Spidey Dude Network on Facebook is the general network Facebook page. But you can also follow this exclusive Twitter handle, @FromErie on Twitter. Follow us there to get show updates at both places. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe if you're listening to us on YouTube. And if you're listening to us on your favorite podcasting app, you can always leave us a 5-star review, and we will read all of that feedback in a future episode. Want to give a shout out before we get started also is to our patrons, Scott and Venkman. Thank you for your support of this show and all the shows on the Spidey Dude Radio Network. As always, we thank all of our guests and our host for this show. And with that, I turn it over.
Welcome back, Gargoyles fans, to another episode of Voices from the Eyrie. I'm your co-host, Greg Weisman, and sitting to my left is my co-host, Jennifer L. Anderson.
Hello, everyone.
And once again, we are joined by the co-creator of the show, the producer of the first 2 seasons, Mr. Greg Weisman.
Hi, everyone.
And we are very, very happy to have with us a man who, this show wouldn't be the same without him, the composer of that exquisite soundtrack, Mr. Carl Johnson.
Hi, everyone. Pleasure to be here.
Carl, thank you so much for joining us. And since you are our guest, we would like to ask you a little bit about your own origin story. How did you get into music? How did you become a composer for television and movies?
Well, I had been a sort of a casual musician all through school. Growing up, I took piano lessons from the age of 7. I played trombone in school marching bands, pretty much a band geek. But I had never taken music seriously. My father was a doctor, and so I figured I'll just become a doctor too. I was pretty good at math and science, and so I ended up going to college doing pre-med stuff. But I was in so many bands in college. I went to the University of Kansas, and I was in the marching band and the concert band and the basketball band and the jazz band, and I was spending all my time doing music, and I was having a hard time getting the school stuff in. And so finally I figured, I'm going to change my major to music. And much to my surprise, I ended up getting a music theory degree from University of Kansas. And kind of, what do you do with a music theory degree? I was playing in a band in Disneyland, the All-American College Marching Band. I had auditioned and gotten into that. And one day I was talking to the band director about it. What am I going to do with a music theory degree? And he said, well, you should consider doing film music. It's a way you can be in music and maybe make some money, make a living. And so I looked into there was a program at that point. The only program really was at USC. And so while I was in Los Angeles, I kind of looked up the guy who was running the program and talked to him and put together some application materials. And the next year, after I graduated from Kansas, I went to the USC film music program. And I've just been fortunate. I kind of got into animation soon after school and have kind of spent the next 30 years doing music mostly for animation.
I remember seeing your name in the credits of so many TV shows growing up, Animaniacs, Batman the Animated Series. How did you remember getting the Gargoyles gig, and how did you design that beautiful soundtrack?
Yeah, well, I had been at Warner Brothers. I was working on Batman the Animated Series, and Shirley Walker was the head composer on that. And Shirley was an amazing mentor to a lot of people. And she kind of, when she was designing what the soundtrack would look like for Batman the Animated Series, she was really approaching it like a feature film. And so there were areas where it was just dialogue and no music, and areas where the music was very moody or dark. And so I kind of had that in the back of my mind when we were talking about Gargoyles and getting it going. So I think I was very much sort of approaching it from that angle, but also trying to work in the kinds of things that I really like doing, melodies and developing melodies and tweaking them and changing them based on what's going on with the story. I think I probably, being a brass player, I probably brought a lot of my sort of marching band mentality to it. Lots of brass, lots of percussion, lots of energetic loudness.
And it was beautiful. We'll circle back to music questions because we also have an episode to discuss. Enter Macbeth, a rather pivotal episode of the series. And Greg, you've described in the past how this one was a game changer, and I'm sure we'll do that again. But I did notice that this also has the first previously on Gargoyles section, if you don't count the multi-parter Awakening. And what led to that?
What led to it really was a disaster. We got this episode back, and our animation studio in Japan had subcontracted this episode out to Wang or Wong, another studio. And this is without a doubt, although there are other that are competitive, other episodes that are competitive, but this is without a doubt the worst animated episode of the series, at least in the first two seasons. And it came back in such disastrous state that we couldn't make our deadline, our air date, which is the cardinal sin in television, is missing your air date. But it was atrocious, and my bosses were like, "Well, just how's the next one looking?" And I'm like, "The next one's looking fine. In fact, it was looking good." And so my bosses just wanted us to reorder them, put the episode that follows for this one. And unfortunately, though, normally I would have said yes to that with some reluctance, but again, you can't miss an air date. We couldn't. And the reason was this was the episode where the Gargoyles moved from the castle to the clock tower. And in the episode that follows, they're already living in the clock tower. And I said, our audience will be incredibly confused by this if we switch them up. So I asked, can we just, run a rerun for a week? I said, if we have that one extra week, we should be able to get it done. And, so they said yes, but Buena Vista wanted to, didn't want to use one of the episodes that had just aired. That is one of the triptychs that featured each member of the trio. So they decided to go back to the very first episode. But if you're going to do that, then that means it's not a 1 week break. It's a 5 week break, because they then aired in succession the 5 week miniseries across the next 5 weeks. So by the time we got back to enter Macbeth, we hadn't had a new episode of Gargoyles in 6 weeks. And we felt that our audience the good news was it gave viewers a second chance to sort of come on board with the show. But the flip side of that was that catching them up to where we were felt like it required a previously. And as I've mentioned on the show before, I was a huge fan of Hill Street Blues, still am, and Hill Street always did previously on Hill Street Blues. So I said, what if we just did? And we'd done it during the 5-parter, so it wasn't that weird. So we just did a little set of clips at the head of it to remind the audience where we left off, and then rolled into it. And again, we had repaired the episode as best we could, but it still makes me cringe to look at it. They're awful animation, off-model stuff, weird stuff. I mean, the scene where Goliath and Alicia confront each other at the end of the episode is just, horrible. Goliath is shaped and sized ridiculously. His head is like 4 times the size of Alicia's head. And then, you have weird things like a cartoon Iron Maiden that looks like it was pulled from an episode of Tales or something like that. And frankly, it might have been. It's kind of a cartoon cat head on it. It's bizarre. There was a limit to how much we could fit. But you'll also notice that in the credits for this episode, no one's listed as the director for the episode, because it was just so many hands were involved in it. And you'll see a lot more of names of artists who were in Los Angeles pitching in on this one, because it was just a all hands on deck emergency fix. So, and I'm saying all this negative stuff to sort of get it out of the way, because I think there's a lot that's great about the episode, but the animation isn't one of those things. So I'm trying to get all my major complaints about it off my chest so that we can then pretend afterwards.
Yeah, I spotted a Scotch tape on the screen at one point in the episode. I sent Jen a screenshot last night.
Yes.
That I didn't notice.
Over 20 years later, there's still new flaws being found. And she and I were talking about... yeah, and we're getting it out of the way now. And she and I were talking about that Iron Maiden earlier.
We were. It's very, almost Cheshire Cat. It's very cute.
Yeah, it's adorable. Just adorable. And that's what we were looking for from an Iron Maiden. An adorable Iron Maiden. That's what
Oh, isn't it precious?
All right. This episode was also written by Steve Perry, and I looked up his resume. He's written a ton of Conan novels, a few Star Wars novels, including, apparently he was near the center of that 1990s multimedia Star Wars blitz called Shadows of the Empire. There was a novel, a video game, comics, action figures. Jen, do you remember that?
Oh, yes, I do. I'm pretty sure I have a lot of those novels.
And he seems to collaborate with Michael Reeves a lot.
Yeah, I think he was one of Michael's main go-to guys. I think I only literally met Steve once in person, even though he worked, all through both seasons. But, he was Michael's guy, and he did a great work for us. Well, I just, he never, or at least can't remember him coming into the office more than once. But yeah, great writer.
And this episode introduces I think it's safe to call Macbeth a fan favorite. What do you think, Jen?
Oh, he definitely is. Like, okay, but he's so different than the Macbeth that we are used to. Much more like, how did you come up with this version of Macbeth?
That was a conversation between Frank Parr, Michael Reeves, and myself. We were talking about, creating a new villain for the show, one that hadn't come out of the original development. Like up to this point, we had Xanatos, we had Demona, we had the Pack. We had done Dracon, which was our sort of mafia stand-in guy, right? And we were talking about what other villain we might like to do. And I said, it'd be great to get someone who, in essence, was sort of Batman-like. So, Xanatos himself is sort of Bruce Wayne still. But we didn't have a villain who was sort of Batman-like. That is, someone who didn't have any superpowers, but just had mad skills and a lot of tech. And so we're like, if we make Batman a villain, what kind of villain would he be in Gargoyles? And then I was saying that
just pulling that he's Scottish.
Well, I was saying it would be great if he had some connection to, the Gargoyles, where they came from. If there was something that it's just not some random guy that Xanatos hires, but if there was some more intimate connection there. And so, what if he were this Scottish king, this medieval Scottish king? And then once you say medieval Scottish king, first name that came to my mind, since I'm a Shakespeare fanatic, is of course Macbeth. And then we were like, oh, that's cool, because that's a cool name for a villain. And then we started very slowly really to figure out a bit of his backstory. And the idea that he had some past history with Demona, which was another hint that he had been lying and that he had not simply, we knew that at this point that Demona had been alive for 1,000 years, even before she hadn't been asleep, frozen in stone. Even before we did this episode, we knew that. But we hadn't come up with all the details of that. And so the idea was, what if this actually is Macbeth? Not just a guy taking on that name, but what if it's him? And what if he's got a history with Demona? And it all sort of moved outward from there. And then, we cast John Rhys Davies as Macbeth, and he's so good in the role. He so got into it, and he was just so wonderful in it, that there's all this great need coming out of his performance to just give Macbeth more and more and more on the show, because John is so good. And that happened with us often. We'd have some actor come in whose performance was so amazing that it's like, oh, we need more of this. We need more of this person, and that happened over and over with us because our cast was so good. And it inspired all sorts of, not stories for themselves, at least motivation for stories.
Nice. John Rhys Davies, I met him at New York Comic Con a few years ago. I got him to sign my copy of Season 1, Volume 1 of Gargoyles. It was either that or Lord of the Rings, but I chose Season 1, Volume 1 of Gargoyles. He had fond memories of the show. He really enjoyed playing that character. And he signed directly under where Marina Sirtis had previously signed it, and he made a joke so that Demona can feel Macbeth's grip around her throat, and then he laughed and said he actually loves Marina. I was amazed he had remembered that much. But I was amazed he had remembered that much, but I cracked up. He was a really fun guy to speak with. And I really enjoy his theme music, so this can bring things back around to you. Carl, thank you for waiting with that great bagpipe theme.
Yeah, I was thinking, reviewing this episode, that we were doing this stuff in the the early 90s, and finding a good bagpipe sound was not an easy thing back then. Now we've got sound libraries and sample libraries, and a lot of that stuff is pretty easily available. But back then, it was very difficult to find a usable bagpipe sound. It would have been nice to hire a live bagpipe player to come into the studio, but I was able to find a sound library that had some good bagpipe stuff in it, and it ended up working. But I was just reminded about how. Go ahead,
Carl. It might help if you talked a little bit about process. I mean, nowadays when we do a show, we score the whole thing, each episode, top to bottom, because of the progress in, sampling and it's affordable. But this show is mostly an orchestra show, right? And
yeah.
A lot of work was libraried in essence. So it might help you explain the process a little, because I don't think people out there really know what it was like in the 90s to score a show.
Yeah. It's an interesting. Reviewing it last night, I was thinking, how did we ever get this stuff done? There were some shows in the 90s that we were doing completely with live orchestra. With Shirley Walker's Batman stuff, that was all done with a live orchestra. The Animaniacs, all of that stuff, completely live. But then there were a couple of shows that were kind of a hybrid of electronics and live. And so for Gargoyles, we had live brass section and sometimes live strings, and then mixed that with some electronic sounds. So it was kind of this mix of live and electronic. And also, just for budgetary reasons, we weren't creating completely new music for every episode. And so, as we worked our way along the season, some of the music that had been recorded for earlier episodes was getting edited into subsequent episodes, just to help kind of fill in the time, because we didn't have enough budget to completely create new music. And so, watching this episode last night, there are a few places where the music editor, who's a very talented music editor, Mark Perlman, was doing this, and but he was pulling in music that I had written for a completely different episode and sometimes completely different situation. And to my ears, it was a little jarring. It's, Greg, I think maybe similar to the animation for you, that there are a few places where I kind of cringe, and it's the music maybe coming in a little bit more gangbusters than I would have written it if it had been something I'd written specifically for that episode. So as the season went along, there was more and more of the score that was derived from earlier episodes.
When you said there were moments when you cringe, I just was going to say, welcome to my world. But but for this episode, again, there's definitely some library in here, but we did sort of pick this one out because of the introduction of Macbeth, for you to sort of say, let's get some new material in here for this character specifically.
Yeah.
So what was, you recall at all what your thinking was about finding the bagpipe, but what your thinking was about the mood you wanted for this character, or the theme you wanted for him?
I can't recall I can't recall if at the time I was working on this episode, I knew where his character was going in later episodes. In my mind, whenever I think about Macbeth, I go to the City of Stone four-parter, and particularly part where he has to leave his wife and the the Weird Sisters. I mean, all of that stuff to me is kind of the culmination of the Macbeth story. And I would like to think that I was trying to set that up in the first episode, but I think what I was doing was coming up with a theme that I thought would be usable down the line, without really knowing exactly how I was going to use it in the later episodes.
Yeah, there's no way when you did this episode we knew about City of Stone here.
But I wish I could say I had the arc all planned out in my head, but I think I was just trying to come up with a theme that would be useful later on.
Yeah,
but
it's fantastic.
Mhm.
Well, yeah, thank you. And it's such an interesting character too. I mean, like you say, that sort of the Batman in the sense of that he's immortal, a mortal. Well, I guess he's immortal too, but that he has weaknesses, and that's always fun to use as sort of musical inspiration.
Indeed, and it was terrific. Great music, an exquisite soundtrack. I'm going to keep saying that, so I'm going to take a drink every time I do.
Thank you. I also there were a few pieces of source music towards the beginning of it, with they're watching a cartoon, and then the guy's kind of lounging around being goofy, and I think that's one of the few times in the series that we actually did stuff that was I don't think we got a lot of mileage out of those cues subsequently. Currently, I'm working on a Looney Tunes series, and the source music that was playing during the little cartoon bit at the beginning of this episode reminds me a lot of what I'm doing right now. So I guess life just kind of goes around in circles.
It's come full circle.
Nice. We'll circle back to you again in a moment. I loved seeing Elisa on crutches. Not that I love seeing Elisa on crutches, but early on, especially for me, the first time I was watching this, actions having long-term consequences. You didn't see that often, if ever, in a afternoon or Saturday morning cartoon, and it was great.
Yeah, in fact, in that case, I think that the delay actually helped us. The plan, obviously. We were just going to say some unspecified amount of time had passed since she was shot in the previous episode. Obviously, it wasn't just a week later that she went from being shot to being walking around on crutches. But so having that 6-week span in between Deadly Force and Enter Macbeth, actually, I think worked in our favor. It was easier to sort of buy into the notion that, and I'm not even saying specifically it was 6 weeks in her life, but the point was it felt like time had passed. So you could buy that she was on crutches. It also, there's, again, the animation. Sometimes she has 2 crutches. Sometimes she has 1 crutch. Okay, she lost 1. Oh, no, she's got 2 again. Oh, she's got 1. Oh, she's got 2. Oh, she's got 1. I mean, throughout the entire episode, the number of crutches, at some point, I thought she's going to have 3 crutches. I just know. But, I think that helped us out. We wanted to show consequences. And again, one of the ways that we were allowed at all to do Deadly Force was because we told Adrian Bello and our bosses, hey, we are going to show the consequences of this. Next episode, she's not just going to pop up as if it had never happened. And we actually put a line into Deadly Force about the bullet having hit her spine, because obviously she's not shot in the leg, which explains why she's, needs rehab, why she's on crutches, all that sort of stuff. And even now I look at it and go, oh, wow, we did cheat a lot, in terms of her recovery and everything. But I guess in a relative world, we didn't show that she suffered from a lot of trauma, certainly nothing along the lines of PTSD or anything like that from the incident. And I'd probably do it differently today and have the consequences be even more far-reaching than we did back then. But for back then in 1993, 94, when we were making this episode, It's pretty revolutionary, just the fact that we put her on crutches. And I'm proud of that, you know. In its little way, I think it took cartoons a step forward a bit.
Agreed.
Yeah, there's so much, just looking at it, 20 some odd years later, there was so much about this series that was so far ahead of its time. It's interesting how far animation and episodic storytelling has come.
I agree. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think we were trying to do some stuff back then that we hadn't seen a lot of, but we had all wanted to see. And Gargoyles being in syndication, and the bosses we had at the time who both actively and sometimes passively, because there were other things at the studio troubling them, letting us, Frank and Michael and I, just sort of have free reign to do what we wanted to do, gave us a unique kind of freedom, which even at the time I knew, even though it was the first show I'd ever produced, I knew even then, this is a unique circumstance. This is not, and I tried really hard to appreciate it in the moment. I didn't always succeed, but you get day-to-day frustrations coming in, I suppose. But in general, it was just a pretty unique set of circumstances that allowed us to try things that had not been tried before.
Well, I think in general, you
Correct.
definitely raised the bar for animation. Like this really, I've always been an animation person. I was always a Saturday morning girl. I always, even in high school, I was getting up on Saturday morning to watch cartoons, but this was a whole different thing, whole bar that definitely raised the bar. And I'm much more harsh on the animated series I watch since then.
Same.
So it's good stuff.
And one other thing that, Greg, you could probably speak to this better than I, but it was really pushing the Disney brand too. At that point, there was almost nothing dark about the Disney brand. There was no Marvel Universe or anything along those lines. So it was, it seemed like sort of an uneasy sort of fit with Disney.
I think it fits in with their their feature stuff though. The Maleficents and the Evil Queens and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. That all has that dark feel to it. But it just not the TV stuff didn't reach there yet.
Yeah.
I agree. I think it fit in historically with the Disney brand, but it didn't fit in. It so didn't fit in with the Disney afternoon brand that at the time they didn't label that as a Disney show. It was Buena Vista's Gargoyle.
Wow.
Buena Vista being Disney's distribution arm. So it was Gargoyles. It wasn't like you can see on the old Disney afternoon shows. It was Disney's DuckTales, Disney's Adventures of the Gummy Bears. I mean, Disney was literally in the title to these shows. Obviously, from an alphabetizing standpoint, a lot of times you see people dropping the word Disney. But if you see the main titles of all these shows, Disney's Tailspin, Disney's Chip and Dale's Rescue Rangers, the name Disney was always very prominent in front. It's not Disney's Gargoyles. People think of it that way now, because since then, Disney has sort of been willing to claim it as one of theirs. But at the time, it was Gargoyles, period. Mm-hmm. And the show was not presented by Disney. It was presented by Buena Vista Television.
Wow.
So they were nervous about it, but they let it go. And that was all we needed. I didn't really care how it was labeled, as long as they let us do what we wanted to do. But yeah, they were always a little scared of it, about what it would do. But I agree with Jennifer. I think historically it's very much fits into the Disney brand. I just think that, there came a point probably in the late 70s through the 80s into the 90s where what Disney meant had been reduced down to a lowest common denominator of playing it safe. And we were just starting to come out of that with movies like Great Mouse Detective and Little Mermaid and Aladdin and Beauty and the Beast and, the movies that sort of began Disney's feature renaissance. But, if you go far enough back, there's plenty of dark material even in Snow White. Certainly in Pinocchio and many of the old films, Fantasia,
Yeah. Well, I think that the coachman from Pinocchio is like one of the scariest characters of all time. So, I guess you're right.
Mm-hmm.
And we also strove, again, not a good episode to take as an example, though there are moments, that the show isn't dark. For example, and I mean that in a literal sense. If you look at Batman the Animated Series, and this isn't a criticism, Gotham is a dark city. And I don't mean that dark like figuratively. I mean literally, it is a dark city. They made a choice to have very little, very focused, specific light sources. They made a choice in the coloring to keep the city very, very dark. And we made the opposite choice because for us, nighttime for the Gargoyles is when they had come alive. So we wanted a Manhattan, unlike Gotham City, we wanted a Manhattan that was full of color at night. They weren't pastel, but it was blues and magentas and neon red and stuff like that but that had that richness to it so that the show wouldn't feel dark in a literal sense. And I think that also helped. It wasn't, dark stuff happens in these episodes, but it's not the overall feeling isn't oppressive. And a lot of that also comes out of Keith David's performance. And which I just we gave all props to John Rhys Davies, but I've got to give some props to Keith in this because this is a great example of Goliath in this episode, starting at point A, at his most stubborn, his most determined not to listen, to not make good choices. And then by the end, with some begrudging reluctance, he agrees to what Elisa and Hudson and Broadway are telling him. And then by the end, comes to terms with it. And I just, that transition from this bitter anger and resentment about having to give up the castle to the acceptance doesn't work unless you've got an actor of Keith's caliber, frankly, unless you've got Keith David himself in that role. I mean, he is able to take us through all those steps of Goliath, and we never lose sympathy with him, even though he's clearly in the wrong at the beginning and stubbornly insisting on being in the wrong at the beginning. And gets in Elisa's face, again, with the worst animation we had in the entire series, but gets in Elisa's face furious at her and wrong. And yet we never lose sympathy for him. And Steve Perry wrote a great script, but I got to say the credit, really goes to Keith's ability, even when he's furious, even when he's angry, for us to feel for Goliath. And that's what Keith David brings,
I love that Elisa never backs down from him. Like, he's this huge imposing figure screaming in her face, but she knows she's right and she's not backing down. She wants them safe.
Yeah. And Sally's great too. This is not in a lot of the episodes, so it's not a showcase for her the way it is for Keith, but or John, but Sally is always fantastic as well. And again, our voice cast, the music, the color, all sorts of things often carry us when the writing, of course, when animation on occasion lets us down, which is what happened in this episode. The episode works because everything else is so strong that it sort of compensates for the lesser quality on the visual side.
Goliath being wrong throughout the episode is one of those things that I thought was a breath of fresh air, because almost always in these action-adventure cartoons from the 80s onwards, the leader was always right. The leader hardly ever, or if ever, made any kind of mistakes, because they were the leader. That's why they were in charge. I mean, you had your Optimus Primes who were always right, your Leonardos who were always right. And am I off base here, Jen? What do you think?
No, I don't think you're off base. It was, you had your leaders that you put up on a pedestal, and they did no wrong. And you know, when you're talking about Optimus Prime and stuff like that, they get to godlike levels of always right.
So when you have someone like Peter Cullen, who, let's be honest, has a majestic voice, I can see how that could happen. But so does Keith David.
I mean, the idea was never to put Goliath on a pedestal, never to make him perfect. He wasn't the smartest guy there, but he was the moral compass. At the same time, we wanted to have the flexibility for him to be wrong on occasion, and to learn and to grow. And you see that here. There's also a great moment that I just wanted to point out. You know, we haven't talked that much about it, but, you know, Macbeth's whole plan is really not about the gargoyles at all. He just wants to use them as bait to get Demona, right? We see the stained glass window that shows him and Demona in it.
I absolutely love that stained glass window. One day I will have it for myself.
It's too bad we burned it in the fire.
Right?
Here. A lot of property damage on this show. I always cringe at it now. As a homeowner now, I always cringe at all the property. But you know, there comes this moment where Goliath is just asking, "Why the hell are you doing all? I don't even know you. Why are you attacking us?" You know, Xanthos pay you? Well, I asked for money because if not, he would have been suspicious. Well, then why? You know, it's like you're just pawn. You're queen. I'm after. And he's like, Goliath's like, what are you talking about? We don't have a queen. Oh no, what about Demona? And once he finds out that I've got you, the last of the gargoyles, he'll come get you. And Goliath laughs, and you can see the origin of Thalog maybe right in that.
I love that laugh.
You know,
tosses his head back and laughs at him, and it's a great sound.
And later, we'll get to it eventually. You know, in season 2, we introduced Thalog, and one of the key things that tease everybody to know that there's some other gargoyle running around sort of posing as Goliath is, we heard you laugh maniacally, and Hudson turns to Goliath and says, "Do you even know how to laugh maniacally?" And I think by that time, we'd all no, of course Goliath would never laugh maniacally, but he's laughing maniacally right here in this episode. And so I think down the road, it's not like I remembered it specifically, but I think down the road when the idea of Thalog came up, part of it was just Keith is so great. And we try to give him as much to do with Goliath as possible, but there's a whole range of things that he's not getting to do because Goliath is, in essence, such an upstanding guy, right? We want Keith to be able to have some fun and break loose. And that was, again, just, the origin of a lot of the Macbeth stuff that followed is just how good John Rhys Davies was. The origin of Thalog, which some members of your audience may not know who that is yet, but the origin of Thalog was giving Keith the opportunity with a different character to just cut loose. And I think maybe this last part of the reason. And so you have this great moment where it's Demona? Know her, I named her. And you're like, what? You named Demona? And that was an intriguing thing that I am quite sure we didn't have the explanation for yet. We threw it in there and said, we'll figure this out later.
They've got history. We don't know what it is, but there's the hint.
Nice.
Right. there are a lot of things we planned out in advance, particularly in season 2, but some things we did not plan out in advance, but we just knew there was always a feeling on the show like, I compare it to what at least legend says Michelangelo used to say about blocks of marble, that he'd look at the marble and he could see the statue inside, and his job was easy. All he had to do was carve the excess out a way to reveal the statue that was already there. And oftentimes working on Gargoyles, it just felt like the actual storyline was there in the air, or out there, or in some parallel dimension or something like that. And all we had to do was figure it out. We just had to let it come to us and it would all come together. And this happened over and over again on the show, where it just felt like, oh yeah, that feels right. Of course, that's what happened. That kind of thing. Even if we didn't quite know it at the time. But yeah, then Macbeth says the bit about just the word Demona, and Goliath just laughs at him. She's our enemy. She wouldn't lift a talon to help us, and Macbeth is just furious because his whole plan now is out the window. And
his house is on fire.
His house is on fire.
By his own hand. Keith David said at a couple of the conventions that the "know her, I named her" line was a line that apparently in the booth the actors had fun with for quite a while.
Maybe, I don't remember, but I'll take his word for it.
I think there's plenty of people.
Street pizza is the line. I remember people having a lot of fun with it forever.
Which line?
Street pizza. Elisa's line for the pilot. You want to wind up street pizza? Street pizza kept coming up over and over and over again.
Nice. Well, know her, I named her. I'm sure there's a lot of fans with dirty minds who can fill in the kind of jokes they were making in the booth with that one. One of the things I found with Macbeth's reaction to all this is I feel like, based on what we learn about Macbeth later, he could have just easily let them go at that point. He does with the Scrolls of Merlin, but here he's so furious he accidentally burns down his own home.
Problem. You let your temper get away from you. That's problem. One thing, though, is that the theme of the episode was home. I mean, in those days, I don't really do this anymore. I've sort of lost interest. A lot of executives back then, and even now, sometimes, although not quite as often, will go, well, what's the theme of this episode? And that was a big deal back in the day. Less so now.
So very clearly home.
Yeah. And so it opens, with Hudson watching Quack Pack on TV, and with Bronx and Lex and Brooklyn playing cards with at least 5 aces that I counted in that deck. That one, it doesn't bother me as much as the crutches, because maybe Lex was just cheating. I don't know. But, Goliath is in the library reading, and then you compare that with Xanatos making his home in prison. And then at the end, it's all about, Macbeth is saying to Goliath, I defeated you at your home. You think you can defeat me in mine, which of course Goliath kind of does. And then his home burns to the ground. So Macbeth loses his home because of for his sins. And then, the whole line that Hudson has is that home is wherever the 6 of us are. Note that they're not yet including Elisa in that. It's, Goliath, Hudson, Bronx, and the trio. Too early in the series for them to view Elisa as more than just a friend and an ally. Although Broadway's getting there. You can see that Broadway is always, after what happened last episode, he's always concerned for her safety. And he also, in an argument between Goliath and Elisa, he immediately takes Elisa's side. Hudson is convincing, but Broadway takes Elisa's side. But, so you see Xanatos return home, feeling good about being home. There's some setbacks. We lost the Grimoire. Fine, we'll deal with that. But right now, what's great is I'm home. And then Goliath coming to terms with the clock tower now being their home, because all that matters is that the 6 of them are together in the same. And that's what home is. And so that runs through the whole episode in a very conscious way. And I think it proves it. Although again, I kind of nowadays when people talk to me, what's the theme of the episode? I have to check myself from rolling my eyes because it's just sort of like we're telling stories here with characters who have lives and stuff, and it's hard for me to worry about some overarching theme to the episode. I don't know that that's significant anymore, but it worked here really well, and so I'm glad we did it.
Nice. Before we circle back to Carl, there is one line that I really like in this show, but for some reason it seems to cause some fans, again, just some fans, some confusion. Some new writer named Shakespeare. I've seen people go ballistic about that line, saying Shakespeare's not new, he's been dead for hundreds of years. And when you try to explain to them, oh, he's new to them, they don't seem to get it.
I don't know how that can be misinterpreted. I mean, clearly, Shakespeare was alive in the 16th into the early 17th centuries, but these guys are from the 10th century. So to them, he's new. I don't know how else one could interpret that line. I mean, it's fun. There's a little irony there for those watching because, of course, to us, we don't think of Shakespeare as new at all. He's classic, right? But to them, he's new. So I don't know where the confusion comes from, but the fun of it, I guess, the idea of calling Shakespeare a new writer is, comically ironic. But to them, it's just accurate.
All right, and here's a question for Carl, not necessarily related to the episode, but what would you say is the biggest difference in composing music for film and television today as opposed to, say, 20 to 30 years ago?
Well, I think the biggest difference is just how we use technology now and the kind of technology that's available. I was remembering that during the stuff in the 90s, this was before the internet, really. I think I had an AOL account with a dial-up modem, and there was no such thing as MP3s. And so technically, everything that had to be recorded, you loaded players into a studio, you recorded them onto tape, you mixed it back onto tape, and the tape went to the dub. Now, 20 some odd years later, and especially during COVID, you've got composers and animators and instrumentalists and mixers, and everybody is working in far-flung locations all over the country, all over the world. And because of data compression and high-speed internet connections, we're able to move these enormous sound files and video files and enormous amounts of information instantly all over the world. And I think it's really increased the quality of what we're able to do now just sonically. Also the quality of the hardware that we're using, the computers and the sound libraries, all of that has really, I think, just in terms of the overall industry, improved the sound quality of the final product. That being said, I don't know if the same improvement has happened with just the pure composition part of it. It used to be that the composition process was kind of sitting at a piano and thinking, okay, what are the right notes? And then how am I going to get those right notes realized? And now more of the effort tends to be, okay, what's the right sound? And it doesn't really matter what the notes are, but as long as we have the right sound, it'll carry the effort. But it's interesting to me, just the difference in how the soundtracks get recorded now versus what we were doing in the early 90s.
Now, you've mentioned a couple times the sound libraries. Is that something you yourself cultivate, or is that something the studios cultivate? A little bit of both?
No, it's completely on the composer. I'm not sure Well, with sound effects, generally the sound effects studio or there's some third party that's responsible for gathering sound effects libraries. But for music and for composers, it's really all on the composer to get their own machinery, their own computer, their own mixing, monitoring setup, and to buy their own sound libraries. And these libraries can be thousands of dollars. And certainly when you've been doing it a while, you've put over the course of years a whole lot of money into sort of collecting different sound libraries from different sources. So it's it's kind of it's not as expensive as having a boat or a horse, but it is it's kind of an expensive proposition to get into, and but it also kind of puts a composer's stamp on the final product, sort of which brushes the painter uses. It's kind of like which sound libraries a composer uses and which ones they sort of gravitate towards. So it's
just for the sake of clarity for the audience, I just want to distinguish between what you're talking about, which is sound libraries that has samples and all sorts of stuff in it, and the music library that we talked about earlier.
Oh yeah. When I'm talking about a sound library, I'm talking about there may be a company who records a violin section, and that violin section playing every note possible, and then coming up with software that allows the composer to put those recordings of the violin section together and make it sound like a real violin section. That's the kind of sound library I'm talking about. Versus, what the music editor was doing was creating a library of already recorded chunks of music that he could then slice and dice and put together in different ways and support the action. But yeah, it's those libraries of specifically recordings of instruments and how those instruments sort of recreate what a live instrument would do.
Right. And so on Gargoyles, again, these days, because there's so much more, for lack of a better term, technical flexibility, we tend to have our composers do entire, new scores for an entire episode. Doesn't mean they may not reuse a theme here or there. They will on an ongoing series, of course. But that's in contrast to what we did back on Gargoyles, which didn't have the budget for that, as Carl mentioned earlier. So Carl would record, I don't know, for the 5-parter, all these music cues for that. And then for some episodes, Mark Perlman did an amazing job, I think, at finding stuff that worked within those episodes from those previous episodes, from those existing cues in the music library, to score an episode that we had no budget for scoring on, in essence. And then an episode like this, it's a mixed bag. There's some brand new cues here particularly for the Macbeth stuff, although not necessarily exclusively for that. But there's also cues that Mark pulled from other episodes to fill in the gaps because we couldn't afford, on the budget that Gargoyles was on, to score it from top to bottom. And I totally hear what Carl's saying, that some of the choices Mark made in this one are jarring, although I have to admit that nothing Mark did wasn't approved by Frank and I. So it's not really Mark's fault. Don't want Mark taking the heat for that. That blame for that has to go to me and Frank.
I just have to say, Greg, that there were some things that Mark did that I thought were brilliant. And I was thinking, man, I don't know if I'd have written it like that, but I sure like it.
Yeah.
I wish I had.
There's some great, Mark is in a lot of ways one of the many unsung heroes on Gargoyles. But we don't use that kind of music editing anymore. least not on the shows I've been working on for the last 10, 15 years. We just don't do that anymore. But back then, we had to build a music library for budgetary reasons and rely on the music editor to find a way to use those existing cues on new material.
Well, and I think the economic change has been that back then there really was no home studio, and you couldn't record stuff in a home studio like you can now, at least not broadcast quality.
I mean, I do remember, not for this episode, but for the pilot, going, I want to say, to the Capitol Records building and watching you conduct the orchestra.
Yeah.
First episode. Was it a
I remember that.
Records?
Yeah, it was.
Yeah, I thought so. And that was just one of the coolest days ever. And it was also a day, the whole idea of imposter syndrome, which even though I've been producing now for 20 plus years, I still suffer from. But that was a day where I was overwhelmed by imposter syndrome. I was the producer, supervising this recording of Carl conducting the orchestra, and just thinking, I can't say anything because I don't know anything about this. I'm such a fake. If I open my mouth, they're going to realize this. I have very cute memories of I think in that case, it wasn't imposter syndrome. I was just a little kid playing at being a producer, I think, that day. But it was also fantastic. I mean, it was just like, oh my God, this stuff is like coming to life. It was so cool.
Yeah.
I think I only think I went with you one day. That was that one day from the very first episode. But I have very, acute memories of that day. And
yeah, that was fun.
Yeah.
And I have one sort of very clear memory of that day. We had recorded all the brass and strings, and then we left some time at the end of the session to do percussion stuff. And we needed a really interesting sound for the very opening frames of the main titles when the kind of the sun is coming up. And I had a percussionist there, and we had this big bass drum, and we were trying to come up with something really unusual. And he said, well, I've got a box of instant rice. Why don't I dump it on top of the drum and see what it sounds like? And he got this box of like rice-a-roni, and we tipped this big concert bass drum so it was flat, and he dumped it on top of the head and then started hitting it with the bass drum beater. And it made this amazing kind of sound. And I was like, yes, let's do it.
That's
record it.
Nice.
That's so great.
I don't think I ever knew that.
Yeah, so the very first seconds of the main title, there's some rice-a-roni bouncing around there on the bass drum.
We'll come back to you in 1 second. There's a moment we didn't discuss, but it's that scene where Bronx is running down Broadway, the street, and Goliath just exposes himself in front of hundreds of people. You could not do that today without cell phone cameras immediately outing him to the world.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, it was the thing that dates the one thing I think that dates this film more than anything else is the cell phone situation. I mean, we've talked about it. No one in this series has a cell phone except Xanatos, who's a billionaire. And of course, Xanatos' cell phone is about the size of a large brick. And no one else has one. And so, yeah, that changes everything. But one thing that scene was very conscious. Michael and I talked about it, I remember, which was just like, the Gargoyles aren't holding press conferences, but they are not going out of their way to hide themselves either. They're a fact of life. They are not going to, just be, they don't want anyone to find their home because then someone could attack them while they're sleeping, etc. But they show up, Bronx comes running down the street like, Zool from Ghostbusters or whatever, and Goliath lands, and then Bronx takes off the other direction to follow him back, and Bronx with his very best Lassie Timmy stuck in a well impersonation, done by Frank Welker, which we felt was more justified because Bronx isn't technically speaking a dog. He is another species of Gargate. But, that whole thing, this very public thing, of course, it happens at night. Back then, no one had cell phones with cameras in them, and no one knew that was coming. So it was just sort of...
There's also a lot of property damage left behind as Goliath gets up into the air again, taking out signs and cars and stuff.
Yeah, lots of property damage. That's the thing. But yeah, we decided, because obviously, Bronx could have shown up in an alley or something, but we were like, no, let's make this public, and because we want that feeling to be part of the show. That yeah, 20, 25 people saw him that night, and they're calling their neighbors and stuff like that, but no one can prove it. So it becomes this sort of urban legend that there are gargoyles around the city coming to life. And that was going to be part and parcel of what we were doing with the show. So it was very conscious to make that a public scene.
Nice. And another question for Carl. What would you say is the biggest challenge in writing music for film and television?
I think for me, the biggest challenge is sort of the everydayness of it. When you're working on a series or even a feature or something, it's not like the composer is taking walks through the woods and trying to come up with ideas. You've got a set number of amount of music you've got to come up with a set amount of time. And I have known composers who are kind of procrastinators, and if you put it off to the very end, it becomes a nightmare for everybody involved. So I think the challenge is trying to approach it with some sort of sense of discipline in terms of scheduling and trying to keep on task. And for me, it's a very it's kind of a head game, just trying to keep focused and keep myself in a position where I can focus on the work and get it done. That I think is the biggest challenge. Just it's a marathon, and sort of a mental marathon, and finding ways of keeping the pace without just completely burning yourself out.
It's interesting because that's exactly how I describe the writing process on a series. I am without a doubt a massive procrastinator by nature, but I'm what you call a deadline writer. In other words, if I don't have a deadline on something, it may literally never get done. But I don't miss deadlines because you got to be professional, and so that means breaking a project down into manageable slices on a nightly basis.
Yeah.
Usually when I'm producing, I don't have time to write during the day. I'm producing during the day. So if I'm writing or editing, that's all taking place at night. So I just chop anything I'm working on, whether it's an outline or a script or a rewrite or whatever, into manageable nightly pieces.
Yeah.
And because otherwise you'd get overwhelmed and it's a marathon. You're doing, we did 13 episodes in season 1 of Gargoyles, 52 episodes in season 2. Typical Young Justice season is 26 episodes. That's a lot of material to get through. And it takes time. And if you look at it like, oh my God, I've got 26 episodes to write or compose or whatever, it's overwhelming. So you slice it up into pieces so that you can make it across the long haul.
And what I have to do is literally come up with a number of minutes per day that I have to accomplish. And depending on the show or what else is going on, it may be anywhere from I have to write a minute of music to sometimes I've had to write 5 minutes of music in a day. But you have to break it up into bite-sized chunks and keep up with it daily. Greg, there was something you said earlier too. I wanted to circle back on talking about air dates, and the cardinal rule is that you never miss an air date. And it's just interesting how much the industry has changed now with streaming and the concept of air dates and even of seasons. Nowadays a season could be 8 episodes, and when it actually gets released to the streamers seems to be a little fuzzy. It's interesting now that that idea of having an air date and something's got to go up onto the antenna tower at the right time. It's completely lost now.
Yeah,
I think for the better.
That's true. Yeah, mostly for the better. I mean, what's interesting is watching the studios pivot to this new system. Mm-hmm. So, a lot depends on what streaming service. So if you're Netflix, it's like we're putting up an entire season or at least a half season up at a time, which means it's not enough to have your first episode done and your second episode done because, hey, I should have another couple weeks for the third one, right? Because no, you got to have 7 to 8 episodes ready to go. Whereas streaming service like Disney Plus or HBO Max and they're exceptions to this too, but they are tending towards still doing let's release a couple episodes up front and then one a week. And I like that better for water cooler talk reasons, and because I think one of the virtues of series television is that ability to think about something before you move on to the next chapter. But studios don't quite know how to deal with that because the streaming services tend not to make a decision about how they're going to release a show until, relatively speaking, the last minute.
Yeah.
And so they still schedule for reasons of budget and man hours, etc., as if there's an air date. Only there isn't. So, I've had moments with studios where I'm like saying, hey, we just need another couple weeks on this one episode. And they're like, no, you'll miss your date. And I'll be like, it doesn't matter. Because the earliest this could possibly drop is such and such, and they'll be like, but you'll miss your date. And I'll be like, in the aggregate, we'll catch up, but this one needs a little more time. So you're going to air it out of order? I'm like, no, that's not necessary. None of them are airing. They're dropping. And, and you have these discussions where, in essence, the old modes are still present in terms of scheduling and budgeting, even if they're not based on reality anymore. There's no actual, it's got to be done by then because it's got to go on the air. It's pain. And I've been working for big studios most recently. I mean, Warner Brothers and Nick and others like that. I don't know if things are more flexible at a smaller independent studio, but I know in terms of these bigger studios, there's some growing pains to shifting the system, and it doesn't help that some series are still, it's not airing on broadcast, they're airing on cable that basically still has air dates and a cable schedule, and some are going to streaming. And so, there's some inflexibility there that's a holdover from the old system. Sometimes when it doesn't need to be. But yeah, back to Gargoyles, back in the day, it wasn't any question. We had dates we had to hit. And when we didn't, and we'll get into this more in season 2, but when we didn't hit those dates, that was considered a major screw up. and we were usually punished for it in one way or another.
Question for Carl. What is the biggest difference between composing freely or under your own inspiration and composing for film and television?
Well, it's kind of like what Greg said. If I don't have a deadline, I can't get anything done. It's very, very rare that I write something just for myself, like a piece of concert music. I have written a fair amount of musical theater stuff just because that's something I enjoy doing. But even then, there's a deadline. We've got a showcase or a something that it's got to be done in time for. But if it's something that I'm just writing for myself for the fun of it, I can almost always find something else more pressing to do, whether it's laundry or
anything
rearranging
to distract you.
Rearranging the cupboards or something. But if it's a project for film or TV, then somebody's paying me to create music on a schedule, and that takes precedence. So I guess I've just kind of gotten to the place where I do need to have a deadline of some kind to get anything done.
I have a question. What is the project that you feel most proud of? Like, what's your like crown jewel, your top thing that you've worked on?
Well, obviously his answer is going to be Gargoyles. But
yes,
other than that, other than Gargoyles.
Absolutely.
I was thinking it might have been, something he won an Emmy for or something.
Well, I'm. This is going to sound like a wimpy answer, but I'm proud of everything I do, or at least I try to make it all professionals. Some projects, have a lot of good karma and good things tend to happen, and other projects sort of seem cursed from the beginning. But whatever I do, I try to make it professional and as good as I can, given whatever the circumstances are. I think there are moments of different projects that I'm more proud of when I look back on them, like that. We were talking earlier about the City of Stone thing, and that moment in part 4. When I look back at the Gargoyles series, which I'm very proud of, I think that's one of the moments that comes to mind first. I remember working on that and trying really hard to get as much emotion into that as possible. But I was pretty young working on that, in my mid-20s, and I think as any writer, I feel like the older I get and the more experienced I get, the more craft I develop. And so it always seems like my most recent project is the one that I feel like I've had the most confidence and craft that I could bring to it. So there's kind of a saying in the music industry that you're only as good as your last 8 bars. So I generally feel like the last 8 bars I wrote are the best ever. But when I go back and listen to them, sometimes they're not.
Legit.
A silly observation, which, Greg, I think you'll appreciate. We've talked a little bit in the past, and we're going to talk about that when we get to Her Brother's Keeper even more, about how you and Kenner weren't necessarily the best partners. Macbeth makes a big deal right away that he would not stoop so low as to attack the gargoyles while they slept. Then Kenner releases the action figure, and his weapons are pile drivers. They're the sort of things quarrymen would carry, designed to smash stone.
I think Kenner was very helpful to us on a lot of levels, and I don't want to make it sound like we were bad partners. I just think that they had what they felt they needed to do to sell toys, and we had what we felt we needed to do to make the show we wanted it to be. And sometimes those things intersected well, and sometimes they intersected okay, and sometimes they intersect poorly. And that's too bad, but in those days in particular, the nature of the beast was that toy sales helped pay for the production of the show. So it's sort of hard to get like, oh, if only we hadn't had to deal with Kenner. Well, if we hadn't had to deal with Kenner, then we wouldn't have had a show at all. It's like people who used to, after Gargoyles was canceled, get really mad at Disney, which I understand on one level, but I'm like, you guys do understand that if it weren't for Disney, you wouldn't have had the show in the first place. And so I always feel like, you have to maintain some perspective. It's not like Frank and I always saw eye to eye. We ultimately always saw eye to eye, but there was some clashing that took place to get us to the eye to eye spot more than once. But, you sit there and you go, oh, if only he hadn't had to deal with me or I hadn't had to deal with him. Well, it's ridiculous. Obviously, the show wouldn't have been the show without both of them. And so I always, want to measure that stuff, not because I'm being politic, but just because it's true. It's a whole symphony, since how's that for a metaphor of the day? It's a whole symphony of people who have to work together to produce something on the level of Gargoyles. It's literally hundreds of people doing hundreds of jobs in multiple countries. Even back then, nowadays, with the way the technology works, we don't even work out of an office anymore. We're all at home, with the pandemic. But it just requires lots of amazing things to happen in order for anything to get produced, and for something to turn out at a level where 25 years later you're still talking about it. That's a lot. I mean, in Watchmen terms, that's a thermodynamic miracle. And any little thing could have just blown it all away or reduced the overall quality of the show to a level that this podcast wouldn't exist, because who the hell would care? Gargoyles 25 years later.
Indeed. I think we can begin wrapping up. Jen, do you have any other questions?
Oh, I think we're doing good.
All right. Before we do, I want to shout out to a friend of mine because, Greg, you mentioned imposter syndrome earlier. When we started scheduling the interview with Carl, I got really nervous because I don't know much or anything about music. I just know what I happen to like. So I had no idea what kind of questions to ask. So I reached out to a friend of mine, Ron Oppenheim, who is a professional musician. I've known him since middle school. We used to watch Gargoyles together after school almost every day. Has fond memories of it. He's a fan.
Feels so old.
Yeah, he's not a fan the way that I'm a fan, but he's still a fan with some fond memories. And it was nice so he wrote up a list of questions that I could ask Carl, and I do appreciate that. And he's working right now as a professional musician in Vienna.
Nice. Well, tell him thank you.
Well,
Carl, you being here has been a delight to this former band geek. I'm so happy that you were able to come onto the show. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you. What a joy. This is a lot of fun.
It really was, Carl. We really do appreciate it. This podcast will be going up in early April, so do either any of you have any projects you would like to plug?
Well, I am in the home stretch of finishing up Looney Tunes cartoons for Warner Brothers. And I've got probably another 4 or 5 months left of work on it. HBO Max will be releasing it in chunks, I think, over the course of this year. I'm not sure when the last release is going to be, but it'll, I think, be during calendar 2022. And I think we've done good work on this show. It's been a lot of fun to sort of go back to my pre-Gargoyles roots of cartoony sort of underscore. But yeah, keep an eye out for it on HBO Max.
And then for me, also on HBO Max, if this is April when you're hearing this, then by now the second half of the fourth season of Young Justice Phantoms, should be dropping weekly on HBO Max, even as we speak. Not really as we speak, because we're speaking back in February. But when you hear this,
time traveling
in April, take the Phoenix Gate and start watching. And then by now it'll have been out for a few months. But if you haven't picked it up, please take a look at the Blu-ray or download Catwoman Hunted, which comes out February 8th, which for us in our time era is just a few days from now. But for you guys, it'll have been out for months. But if you haven't checked it out, please do. It's an anime-style movie that I wrote and stars Elizabeth Gillies as Catwoman and Stephanie Beatriz as Catwoman. Has a lot of former Gargoyles actors in it, including Keith David and Jonathan Frakes and others. So please do check it out.
All right. And Jen?
I don't have anything big and beautiful going on, but I might have snuck some Gargoyle stuff up on my Redbubble, and you can find that through my website, heyassbutt.com.
Hey, assbutt.
And I might be sneaking some more stuff up by the time this airs.
Excellent. And I want to thank you all once again. Carl, thank you so much for coming on. Thank you for that exquisite soundtrack all those years ago, which keeps us captivated to this day. I mean, they say a movie or TV show is only as good as its soundtrack to set the mood. So thank you for that. And,
well, thank you.
And Greg, thank you for all your time always, for everything you do. Jennifer, perfect partner in crime. Let's do crime together again soon and always. and to all of you who are listening, thank you. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and join us next time for The Edge, where we hope to have a surprise.
Know her? I named